coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
Yeah, at a press conference, this one reporter from Albany asked the governor, she said, well, do you have any data demonstrating that crime in New York is being driven by legal gun owners? And the governor said, well, I don't need data. I don't need a data point for that. This is like, I know that this is going to make New Yorkers safer. And it's clear that, well, obviously it's not, because legal gun owners are not committing gun crime in New York State. We talked about the statistics last week, but it sort of made it obvious that what this is, it's strictly happening in the realm of politics and ideology. The governor is angry that the right has won this battle nationally in the courts. So she's going to just take it out on their representatives in New York State, who are like the people who own guns. So that's who she can't go after, the actual criminals, because they're essentially her constituency.
Right.
So she has to go after, so it's not going to do anything. But you should see the New York politicians are just going crazy, congratulating themselves on having passed this as like a rebuke to the Supreme Court.
Hello, and welcome to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast from The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor at The American Mind, and I am joined this week once again by Seth Barron, managing editor of TAM. Just the two of us today as our fellowship continues on apace. I believe it will be wrapping up pretty soon, and then we should have a fuller compliment for you guys. But this is the summer crew, the Night Watch, gathering faithfully here to discuss a range of things, actually. First of all, happy 4th of July to everybody. I don't think we said that last week, but we hope that you were appropriately patriotic, that you grilled in your backyard, that you saluted the Declaration, that you read the Declaration, and that you had a restful and contemplative time with friends and family. I know we all did. And we're back, tanned, rested, and ready, excited to talk about a number of funny things this week. First of all, we thought we'd mention what's going on in the Netherlands. There have been these Dutch farmers that are protesting environmental regulations, and maybe it's just my newsfeed bias, but I've seen almost no coverage of this in the legacy press. It's been an object of attention for some conservatives, but it's so difficult for Americans to pay that much attention to foreign politics or foreign news stories that don't directly affect us. I think this hasn't really landed in the way that it could have. It's a kind of an amazing story. I guess the Dutch government announced that it was imposing targets to, quote, reduce harmful nitrogen compounds by 2030. And much like the EPA regulations that were recently discussed in front of the Supreme Court, it was basically admitted that these were designed to eliminate certain businesses and certain people from existence, not, of course, by killing them, but just by taking away their livelihood. So the honest message, this is the government statement, the honest message is that not all farmers can continue their businesses. Naturally, farmers, much like kulaks, do not take kindly to being liquidated, and so they took to the streets instead. And I guess this is something that has happened before in the Netherlands, from what I understand, that there's sort of a convoy of tractors, that they're blocking a port with trawlers, and that in general they're trying to, as it were, disrupt life in the Netherlands so that people take notice of the fact that their livelihood is under threat. There have been shots fired recently on these guys, a claim that they were attempting to run people over. And we thought we could discuss this just in the context more generally of kind of popular outbursts, working class outbursts that embarrass either socialist governments or just generally kind of collectivist governments, which like to think of themselves as champions of equality and defenders of the lower classes. This is a long history going all the way back, in fact, to the liquidation of the kulaks, to which I referred. I mean, you can read Lenin's order to hang kulaks in public so that they don't, so that they stop protesting about having all their food taken away to furnish supplies for the war effort and to feed the cities. You can, look at any number of instances of this from the Soviet Union, but you can also just look at, recent European history. People can perhaps remember the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest protests, which had to do with unfair fuel taxes, and generally just a kind of exacerbated economic inequality from globalist policies designed to project a certain environmentalist virtue. This was uncomfortable for the French government, and among others at the time, Emmanuel Macron, not a big fan of the Gilets jaunes, and didn't look too good for him. On top of which, of course, you've got Canada, right? The trucker convoy in protest of the vaccine mandate, during which we were treated to the spectacle of Justin Trudeau, everybody's favorite boy band president, freezing bank accounts over trucker protests. Of course, these things are loud and obstructionist, and conservatives that don't like BLM might also have sympathy for people that are just trying to, get to work past the trucker convoy or whatever. But of course, also, the sort of totalitarian measures that Trudeau took have really, I think, really did make a dent in foreign news outlets and sort of shocked the world. Jordan Peterson, who's from there, was saying that he's been traveling and has been amazed at how low Canada has fallen in people's estimations, particularly for this act of freezing and then eventually unfreezing these accounts that were tied to the trucker protests. And I just want to loop in, people don't really know about this, but the CPC, the Communist Party of China, has also found itself required to crack down on Marxist reading groups because they're like too, revolutionary. They threaten the established power structures. I mean, people who kind of take a jaundiced view of Marxism generally tend to observe that it always starts out with a revolution, quote, for the people, for the proletariat, and then hardens into a kind of oligarchy and despotism. But it is amazing to watch some of this going on here in the West too, not necessarily always under the banner of communism or Marxism, but always, these little clashes between governments that represent themselves as sort of tolerant and open and focused on economic equality, and then protests by the actual lower classes that are being, ground into the dust by these, environmentalist policies that are incredibly punishing, that have more to do usually with protesting virtue than with actually reducing emissions, and just by the inherent despotism of a highly bureaucratized ruling class. So I'll leave it at that, but I just wanted to, Seth, have you been following this at all, and what do you make of it?
Yeah, a little bit. Well, yeah, I think the irony is rich, and particularly around this, environmental issues. I mean, this is not a popular issue in the sense of coming from the people. The entire environmental movement, and forget about the environment, not the environmental movement, the whole climate change movement is, totally driven from the top and imposed on, huge sectors of the economy that are going to bear the brunt. And, the elites are very blithe. I mean, during the last election cycle, you saw Biden saying, yes, I will shut down the fossil fuel industry.
Right.
And then it's all padded with this claim, no, but you don't understand. We're going to move all of you people into better jobs, like good, clean energy jobs that are going to replace the dirty jobs that have been feeding your family for generations. Now, we right? I mean, we haven't really seen violence, but, take a look at this. Consider West Virginia, which for a long time was an extremely, solidly Democrat state. And it flipped. It flipped completely at the same time that the Democrats turned against fossil fuels. I mean, it used to be that Democrats would be strongly supportive of coal miners when they, struck, when they fought against their employers, right?
Sure.
And now they're totally the enemies of the coal miners. I'm sure Biden would claim, no, I love the coal miners. I just don't want them to be coal miners. I love it's kind of the way Hillary Clinton said, I love what America could be.
Right.
This sense that that there's something great about America and Americans. It's just that they're not there yet. So what you've seen in West Virginia is the entire political, inclinations have swapped, and now only Joe Manchin is the only Democrat elected to office in high office in West Virginia. It's funny because West Virginia just the West Virginia Democrat Party just had a whole series of a big elections in their state party, and they've gone far to the left. So there's this idea that Joe Manchin will no longer have all the power. Like, they're really angry at him. But it's just a fantasy because, so all you're going to do is unseat him as the one Democrat. It's not like they're going to, but I know this is not exactly what you were talking about, but this is the kind of war we see going on when you try to impose deeply unpopular, anti-working class, anti-middle class policies in order to change the economy. And I think everybody knows that that's what the environmental movement has turned into, is this effort to restructure the economy to favor certain elites in this way that it's not, I don't really see it necessarily going to work. I mean, wind and solar just aren't there, right? And, as far as people still like to eat meat. So, as much as Bill Gates would like to get us all tucking into a botfly barbecue, I don't know when that's going to happen. Let me just add another thing. In New York City, there was a big organizing movement to organize the Amazon warehouses, right? Amazon is very anti-labor. And there was a large warehouse on Staten Island, and they actually did get it organized. I think it was the first Amazon warehouse to vote to have a union, right? To have a bargaining unit. But what's funny is that none of the leftist politicians in New York City, like AOC, were behind it. Okay, they jumped on the bandwagon afterward, but they weren't really for it. And it's like, well, why weren't they? And it's like, because they're not really that interested in achieving those kinds of local grassroots successes. What they want is, say, for healthcare, they want to see a national healthcare scheme put into effect, right? They want they want Medicare for all. They don't really want to see workers carving out a better deal just for themselves. Like that to AOC, how does she benefit? What does she get out of that? You see what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah.
So there's an interesting conflict at work here. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of Dutch politics, which I gather are pretty complicated.
Yeah.
But it sounds like a similar dynamic.
Exactly. I mean, that's what's interesting to me about it. Very much also from the outside. And I count myself among those Americans who have a hard time really focusing on foreign politics for very long. But I think that what you're describing about the kind of intra-left conflict or schizophrenia or whatever you want to say is a very real and enduring feature, at least of 20th century leftism. I'm thinking as you're talking about this book, The Road to Wigan Pier. Did you ever read this?
Of course,
early
sure.
George Orwell. Yeah. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners have read it too. But this is young George Orwell, 1937, goes out to Lancashire and Yorkshire and interviews the miners and the working class folks. And it's a, it grapples with his views on socialism and so forth. But this is like, the eventual famous critic of the Soviet Union and of doublethink and all of that, like at the very least, agree or disagree with him, like actually going out and sort of talking to people that are suffering from difficult working conditions. And as you say, Seth, like this used to be the left's bread and butter, would be mobilizing people against whatever, awful oppression they were suffering under in their actual communities, at their actual jobs. But you do have kind of simultaneously with this, you've always had this line of like, the people are insufficiently revolutionary. Which I think is kind of a truer interpretation of Marxism. Like if you really get down to Marx's thesis on Feuerbach and like his his more major works, like there is this stance of just standing, history is moving toward like a kind of butterfly bursting out of a chrysalis. These internal contradictions are eventually producing the advent of the next phase, and we should fervently hope for this. But like when it doesn't actually quite turn out that the people are super on board with your idea about the next step, then it's the people who are wrong and your vision of the future that's right. I mean, that's kind of why I started out talking about Lenin, and I do think it's sort of baked in. Like when AOC, who's a great person to invoke here, when she goes on, what was it, 60 Minutes, and she says like there's a lot of people who are more concerned with being factually correct than being morally right. Like that's kind of boils it right down. The reality is wrong and my moral convictions are correct. And I do kind of feel like that's a contradiction that really is heightening right in front of our eyes. And I wonder like what's going to come of it. As you say, how much potential is there here for this to turn violent? Like, surely they can't just go on freezing people's bank accounts until like they shut up, or maybe they can. I mean, maybe that's just sort of the bleak, picture a human boot stomping onto a human face forever or whatever. But I don't know. That doesn't seem very likely.
Actually, it's funny. We had another example of that this week in New York, because as you know, we talked last week about how the Supreme Court had this major ruling on gun rights.
Right.
Well, in response, the governor called the legislature into an emergency session, and they passed the most extraordinary, what they now call gun safety, but really what they used to call gun control bill, probably in the country. Limiting where you can take, basically making it that you can't if you carry a gun, you can't carry it into any private business unless the private business specifically puts up a sign saying it's permissible. You have to give, some bureaucrat who's going to review your application, you have to give them all of your social media accounts. Jeez. So they can review them to see if you're like a good character. Anyway, at a press conference, this one reporter from Albany asked the governor, she said, well, do you have any data demonstrating that crime in New York is being driven by legal gun owners? And the governor said, well, I don't need data. I don't need a data point for that. This is like, I know that this is going to make New Yorkers safer. And it's clear that, well, obviously it's not, because legal gun owners are not committing gun crime in New York State. We talked about the statistics last week, but it sort of made it obvious that what this is, it's strictly happening in the realm of politics and ideology. The governor is angry that the right has won this battle nationally in the courts. So she's going to just take it out on their representatives in New York State, who are like the people who own guns. So that's who she can't go after, the actual like criminals, because they're essentially her constituency.
Right.
So she has to go after, so it's not going to do anything. But you should see the New York politicians are just going crazy, congratulating themselves on having passed this as like a rebuke to the Supreme Court. But, I guess what you were saying reminds me of that Brecht line when he's talking about the East German government and its frustrations with how insufficiently revolutionary the people are. He's like, it's really time that we elect a new people.
Yeah, exactly. That is literally what Lenin said. He wrote this letter ordering the kulaks to be hanged, and the postscript is find tougher people, right? We need a better proletariat. And yeah, just one last thing before we maybe move on to another topic is that we did mention last week that there was this EPA versus West Virginia decision sort of still to come from the court. And it's pretty opposite to this whole discussion, not only because of the sort of the logic of, climate change environmentalism, which has very much become a logic of total economic restructuring, the Great Reset, so on and so forth. But also just because of the sort of naked Wilsonianism in the dissent. So I guess to update people if they don't know, like what happened is that the court did not overturn Chevron, which would have been the kind of big win for the so-called non-delegation doctrine that the EPA and other bureaucratic agencies can't interpret the law, basically on their own and become their own little fiefdoms. But they did sort of reassert the major questions doctrine, which is what also overturned the OSHA COVID mandate in the workplace. And it basically says, like, if you've got a major question that isn't resolved by the law, then Congress needs to make a clear statement to resolve it. And so sort of squishy middle sort of decision. But the really interesting part is the back and forth between Gorsuch, also a bit squishy, and Elena Kagan. Gorsuch sort of making these references to Wilson, who, of course, famously thought that we had outgrown the idea that the people should decide. Popular sovereignty was outdated and the long march of history had gone beyond it. And Gorsuch is sort of taking these lame swipes at Wilson. Meanwhile, Kagan is just full on going full Wilson, the people and their elected representatives don't know enough to make these decisions. They have to hand these things off to experts because otherwise, how are they going to get it right? And there is there's a non-negligible portion of people in very serious and enduring, in many cases, unelected roles in government who just think that. It's not even a kind of hidden. You have to unpack the esoteric implications of their beliefs. It's that's their actual philosophy. And so, yeah, I do think that the right is becoming at least a home for people that thought the left was there to speak to working class interests. I mean, this is the whole populist turn, right? Anyway, we could go on about this for I think quite some time, but let's move on to this weird little story that Seth sent to me. I had not even really seen it. But this is the story of our friendship, Seth, this weird little story that Seth sent me out of the blue. But it did just happen today, and it's not actually that little. I mean, people are talking about it. So there's this monument called the Georgia Guidestones, which I had heard of, but had forgotten all about. And it's this it's been called satanic. It's got this flat, I guess, granite slab kind of look. I don't really know what it's actually made of, but it has a very sort of, brutalist, the brutalist take on Stonehenge is what you could compare it to. And inscribed on it are these principles or directives or whatever. I'll just read some of them because they're true. Again, if you carved the brutalist take on Stonehenge and then Gene Roddenberry inscribed onto it the principles of the New World Order and the World Economic Forum, this is kind of what you'd get. Principle 1, maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature, guide reproduction wisely. That's always, the good guys are always the ones saying that, right? Guide reproduction wisely, improving fitness and diversity, unite humanity with a living new language. So I hope you're excited, Seth, to practice your Esperanto.
Yes.
Avoid petty laws and useless officials. That one's pretty good. Prize truth, beauty, love, seeking harmony with the infinite. Be not a cancer on the earth. Leave room for nature. Leave room for nature. So this is a weird monument to begin with. And now somebody seems to have partially blown it up. So I would like to know, Seth, who did this? I mean, I find this almost impossible to parse. And with all of these acts of political violence that we've had in the last, couple of years. This is one that just seems like it doesn't map neatly onto any of our pre-existing narratives, and for that reason alone, it's fascinating.
Well, yeah, it's I really like your Star Trek sort of connection there. It does seem like that. I mean, these things are huge. It's 19 feet tall.
Jeez,
It
yeah.
it weighs like, I don't know, 40, like 100 tons or something like that. So yeah, and the idea that somebody bombed it, the idea that somebody was concerned enough about it to bomb it. I mean, I had read, I'd heard about the Georgia Guidestones before. It's the sort of thing, like people who are really into ley lines, and you know what
Okay.
ley lines are? Like,
No.
okay, ley lines are they're like Roswell, Oklahoma, is like the Murrah building and the Great Pyramid of Cheops are all on the same
Oh,
latitude.
yeah.
Like this type
Okay.
of thing.
It's totally, yeah. I mean, it's all the same.
It's this
Yeah.
type of thing. And I
Right.
guess the Georgia Guidestones had like some astronomical function. Like, well, I mean, basically, it just had incorporates a sundial. And I know that people see it as, yeah, exactly, some kind of like outgrowth of like the Bilderbergs or the. I mean, it's all in that kind of conspiracy theory, like Twilight world.
Right.
So the idea that someone blew it up, I mean, there's something vaguely comical about the whole thing in the sense that it's like it's funny that someone built the Georgia Guidestones,
Yeah.
and then it's funny that someone took it seriously enough to blow it up.
Well, right. I
But
mean,
then,
yeah.
how funny is it really? I mean, if people are actually going to blow stuff, I mean, it's like, what is the squabble? What is the argument?
Well, it is another right. When does it stop being funny? And I think a good rule of thumb is like it stops being funny when things start exploding and people start getting hurt,
Yeah.
And yet, that fact that we even have to ask that question is just another instance of this. Like, when does kind of very online messing around and conspiracy theory joking shade over into these real life activities? And this is like right on the bubble. It's right on the edge of that. And yeah, one of the things that online discourse is really good at is like making it seem plausible that the Illuminati are somehow wrapped up in Pizzagate, and like look at this line across the earth where everything sits. I mean, that's sort of why Stonehenge came to my mind as well, because that too is supposed to be this, like, maybe aliens made it. It's like the pyramids. It's in this particular arrangement. Nobody knows what it's for exactly. And there is a sense that I guess we've talked about this a lot on the show about conspiracy theories and the fact that even though all of the details of them are false, the like artistic picture of the world that they paint is very persuasive, because people do have this accurate sense that a cabal of sort of undifferentiated and Star Trek outfit wearing globalists is conspiring in ways that are only sort of visible as a kind of coded, jargon laden, outward facing message. They're actually conspiring to like shut down the coal industry and do all of these things that are actually happening, or to trans your kids, which is also really a thing. And so I sort of wonder whether that's part of the part of this too, is just like, here's this object that looks like an embodiment of the occult, and somebody with these sort of inscriptions on it that vaguely code it as being maybe globalist or like Great Reset related, and somebody just wants to like take an axe to that whole system, and like this was the symbol of that. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here, but it is
Well,
weirdly associated with that.
I mean, kind of in a less funny vein, I mean, you've got this guy up in Illinois, this total freakazoid who, just shot up the 4th of July parade the other day. who also seems in this very online way to have intentionally encoded himself and his intentions as opaque, or if not opaque, as branching into various different and opposing semiotic possibilities. Like, okay, he intentionally had took pictures of himself at Trump rallies, like wearing a Where's Waldo outfit. And just like, so it's just totally bizarre. Like there's something kind of Oswald-y about it, the way in which Oswald, like, okay, here's this kid who had, everything about Oswald is somewhat like vague and weird. His accent didn't make any sense because he lived in New Orleans, the Bronx, and Dallas. He'd been sent to jail while he was in the military. He was at a U-2 Air Force base. Then he defected to the Soviet Union and married a KGB colonel's niece. Then he came back. I mean, and what was he, 23 when he killed the president? So, but it's been, and he was involved with this Fair Play to Cuba committee at the same time that he was seems to have been involved with people in the extreme right or in the FBI. So all I'm saying is it's almost like this guy and maybe some of these other killers are trying to like put themselves into, like, encode themselves within a very, like, with what they imagine to be a very complex, like, riddle.
Right.
And become part of the narrative of just weird, unknown things.
So I imagine that our listeners will go with us into this rabbit hole because this has been, I mean, the first episode of this show was about Epstein and not killing himself or killing himself. Oh. And so this has been the theme of the Roundtable since like the very beginning. And there is something, that merits discussion, even though there's nothing quite definite that you can pin down about this sort of thing. Therefore, all this by way of preface to my telling a story that I sometimes tell about this. I was on this listserv, and it was an academic listserv, so very just like nerdy in the weeds discussions of like, where can I find this essay, or what's the etymology of this Greek word, whatever. And at one point, it got hijacked by a schizophrenic who would send those kinds of emails that schizophrenics send, or like blog posts that they write with everything's in Comic Sans, and like, here's the Star of David, and here's the Illuminati symbol, and like, and here's the Om symbol, and they all connect, and this is a sign that everything is, and there was a weird way in which like the schizophrenics like connection of all these obscure and probably unrelated details was like the crazy shadow side of what the academic list was already doing, which is just trying to like parse out these many, find order in the universe and put everything in its place. And yeah, your sense that these lunatics are trying to sort of insert themselves into our incredibly confusing and kind of contradictory politics in a way that just like jams the gears up so that nobody can quite parse them, but they nevertheless like, you can't get them off your mind. I don't know. I think there's something, maybe this is just like attributing way too much thought, but I mean, I'm not even attributing this necessarily to conscious thought so much as just saying like, maybe that's part of the impulse here. We've said before that like basically these shooters, it's like the way to interpret them most directly is by saying they are deeply disturbed individuals, but they're disturbed. I don't know, that quality of being disturbed like expresses itself feeds itself into a machine of American politics, and American politics right now is incredibly disorienting and sort of crazy in and of itself. So there is a way in which like that is sort of reflected back in these acts of violence.
Yeah, I mean, like this guy in Highland Park. Look, I don't want to give him any credit, any more credit than he deserves, which is like zero.
Right.
But it is clear that he seemed very preoccupied with like symbology, like tattooing these numbers on his face and these weird signs he had. And even if it doesn't mean, it obviously doesn't mean anything
Right.
in reality, but it does feed into this sense, like as you described, this schizophrenic interpretation of American history. Like he's just sort of writing himself into like the netherworld version of how America works.
Yep.
So, I mean, look, does it really matter? I mean, no, I'm not going to, he's not like, he's not like anybody. He's not brilliant. He's nobody. He's just a wannabe, like, Charles Manson type,
right?
But with less charisma, with no charisma.
Sure.
But it's weird when when violence and conspiracy begin to become recursive and feed themselves, right?
Yeah, I mean, if it matters at all, right, as you say, you hesitate to even kind of look too deeply into this stuff because you don't want to attribute anything but just, malice and sort of demonic possession to these sorts of people. And yet, right, perhaps it matters in this way, which is like, we would like there to be fewer such people, and we would like to create conditions under which this happens less and less. And like, this is why when this is raised, it's important to talk about things like fatherlessness and, even gun safety in like local communities and all this stuff. And just, generally responsible community ethics and so forth. But it's also, I think, important to talk about the role that our own like fever dream of a political landscape does kind of provide some sort of invitation to these people, right? I mean, this is why the like racialist stuff is so toxic, is that it invites people to like interpret their own mania in terms that are sanctioned by the regime. Like, yeah, well, if you can cash out your madness in terms of like black people are evil, or in terms of like black people have always been oppressed and white people are evil, then of course, like you have just one more nudge in the direction of like acting on this stuff. And that does seem like that does matter. It matters that we like try to restore a little bit of sanity to our politics so that it doesn't invite insanity.
Yeah, agreed.
Well, let's talk about a slightly, well, actually, it's not even. I was going to transition by saying let's talk about a slightly cheerier subject, but it's really not slightly cheerier.
No.
Except the only slightly cheerier thing is that it may not have ever actually happened, which we'll get into. But this is, geez, okay. So Governor Kristi Noem, she of South Dakota fame, goes on CNN and is challenged to respond to this case of a 10-year-old girl who got pregnant through rape and had to go from Ohio to Indiana for an abortion because, now that Roe v. Wade is overturned, stricter abortion laws are going to be possible in certain states. And, this is sure to be the first of many. We've talked before on the show about how the pro-abortion case always hinges upon these incredibly awful horror stories, nightmare, tragic scenarios. And so this is one that I'm sure will come up again. Noem is not the first person to be faced with this. And I don't know. I haven't watched the whole segment, but it seems like she sort of tried to deflect and say, well, why this is a terrible thing and we need to prosecute this rapist, all of which is, of course, certainly true, but not probably likely to. It doesn't seem like she was fully prepared for this bombshell. And the other dimension of this is like it's a little unclear whether this person actually exists. There's a thread by Megan Fox at Megan Fox Writer on Twitter. I guess she's at PJ Media, and she has a list of sort of red flags that make her think this is kind of made up. One of which, I'll just read it. She says, a pregnant 10-year-old is evidence of a heinous crime against a child, but in every article, and there are so many, there is no mention of criminal investigation, no police involvement, not even a town where this allegedly occurred. And this is, the whole thing is sourced to this woman, Dr. Caitlin Bernard, who is an unnamed alleged child abuse doctor called Dr. Caitlin Bernard, who's actually an abortionist. She's in Indiana. So this is like, sorry. So I should say the unnamed child abuse doctor called Caitlin Bernard. Caitlin Bernard becomes the source of the story, and she's the only source of the story. And she has, of course, doctor-patient confidentiality. So there's really no way of like verifying this. And I guess the question that I want to ask is like, obviously it matters very much whether this happened or not, in terms of it would be atrocious and terrible if it did happen and would require criminal investigation, as Fox points out. But in terms of its use in this, attack on states with harsher abortion laws, like, does it even matter if it happens? Like, what would be the difference if it had never happened but were just created? Because so often these things are hypothetical anyway. Now it sort of seems like this is being trotted out as like, maybe it exists, maybe it doesn't. But it doesn't matter, because they're basically saying like, this could happen, right? Like, what if a 10-year-old girl was raped and got pregnant? So I don't know. I'm sort of ambivalent about this in terms of like, it could have existed or not. But like, Seth, doesn't it sort of not matter whether it did or not?
Well, I think that's exactly what they would say.
Right.
Like, when it turns out not to be true, they'll say, well, so what? And it's not just Kristi Noem who's getting this. I mean, I think they're asking basically everybody.
Yeah.
Well, do you support this? Like, what do you say? I mean, because it seems when I read about it, they said she is 6 weeks and 3 days pregnant. Well, that would indicate that they know precisely, the day it happened, the day she was raped.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, clearly it should be I'm not saying it should be national news, but you would think that you could look into where this happened and find out, right, is there a police investigation? Do they have someone in custody? Are they figuring out who did it? But yeah, but look, here's the thing is, next time it'll be an 8-year-old. This is going to be what they trot out forever. They're going to find a lot of these, kind of limit cases, and this is going to be the new fight. I mean, it seems like it's a little too convenient.
That's another Megan Fox point. Is like,
why? I mean, I would imagine they probably could have found. I mean, if they maybe waited or like poked around a little bit, couldn't they have found like a 15-year-old who was? I mean, I don't know. It seems like they really wanted to push it to make it a 10-year-old, a pregnant 10-year-old, to make it as bad as possible. But look, there's going to be a lot of these. There are going to be all kinds of like crazy examples that they come up with. If it turns out that this wasn't true, nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to, it doesn't change their argument. So, this is another one of those things that's going to have to be. I mean, I guess I saw like Ben Shapiro saying, someone was asking about rape and incest. He's like, okay, well, look, if you'll grant me that the 99% of abortions that aren't rape or incest are bad, can we do that? Can we do that and then talk about it?
Well, that's right? A really good point. Yeah, I mean, because right, this is the thing is, as we discussed, I think at some length last week, like, the obvious point at issue here is whether abortion kills a person. And if you can concede that, yes, it kills a person, so we shouldn't do it, except in these extreme cases, like, what are the extreme cases? That is a conversation that I'm pretty sure the vast majority of Americans on both sides would be ready to have, except for that first admission, right? It's killing a person. Yeah. And it's like, but right, like pro-lifers, let's say, the vast majority of pro-lifers would be ready to have that conversation. Well, what if this case happens? What if a 10-year-old girl were impregnated? But that is like so phenomenally not the point. Like, that is just, as you point out, right? Like, it would be a good answer, or I guess Shapiro points out, like, that would be a good answer. It's like, okay, so let's say that in all other instances abortion is wrong. Like, can we talk about this? No, I mean, I sort of wonder, like, what traction this is going to get. There is a battle on this issue, I think, for people's hearts and minds. And so maybe, this is going to be a very effective rhetorical tactic to pull out. There's also, though, a certain exhaustion. I mean, this stuff is kind of well-trodden ground. Like, we've been over again and again. Like, well, what about these incidents? What about these extreme cases? But no, I mean, maybe it's just sort of like something that politicians are going to have to get better at responding to, a la Shapiro.
Well, you know what? I mean, what I think is really interesting about the Dobbs case,
yeah,
and it's something that people on both sides of the issue are going to have to get used to, which is this is really going to animate state politics.
Yeah.
Especially in purple states. And I don't know for sure. I mean, look, there's a lot of assumptions being made that Texas is a firmly a red state. And if you look at how the state legislature breaks out in most of these states, they're pretty it's pretty one-sided.
Yeah.
But maybe the Dobbs case will be a test of how red Texas really is.
Interesting.
And look, if that's the case, then fine. Look, if the women of Texas decide to turn the legislature blue,
right?
I mean, you can't really argue with them. At this, on the terms of what how the right has fought to overturn Roe, this is what they wanted. So if the voters say, well, we want abortion in Texas or wherever, North Carolina, well, back to the drawing board, right? I mean,
no, totally. Yeah. I mean, this is a really fair point, is that, we said we were up for this fight, and we said that we needed to be having this fight because otherwise we were just putting a kind of lid upon this incredibly contentious issue. And we do believe that we can win this fight. I mean, look, my feeling is sort of why is it hysterical and alarmist when pro-lifers show gruesome images of dismembered fetuses, dismembered babies, right? Why is that a kind of scaremongering and scare tactics? But this potentially invented 10-year-old pregnant child is a perfectly legitimate form of political argumentation. I mean, I do think that probably the right, which often gets antsy about down and dirty politics and, fighting this fight on the ground, might have to get over some of its squeamishness, which the left taught us this squeamishness. They taught us it's nasty and bad to show what it looks like when you do an abortion. And so, all the nice, respectable conservatives with their bow ties on were well, I guess we should just limit ourselves to but my feeling is you're right, Seth, this is a fight that state level politics is going to be focused on for a while, and conservatives need to take the gloves off. If there's going to be a big emotional push about all the rape victims, then there damn well ought to be a big emotional push about all the babies drowned in saline solution. Fair is fair. And actually, I think that our emotionalism reflects is designed to drive home the reality of abortion per se as an act, whereas theirs is sort of designed to distract with these extreme cases. So hopefully that's a fight that we can win, but we will see. There's another last little fillip that we want to talk about. This actually is a lighter item. The last one, very much not a lighter item, it turned out, but this one is. So Bette Midler, a former gay icon, erstwhile gay icon, has become basically a sort of deranged Twitter bot. I find it difficult to believe that Bette Midler even exists anymore as a physical human in actual space. I think she's just this sort of flower on Twitter that tweets out these all caps. I mean, after Roe, she tweeted something like, "Get ready, gays, you're next," which is a great this is mean mommy. I mean, maybe there's something deeply psychological about having your gay icon screaming at you that you're about to be disenfranchised and put into gulags. But we won't get into that because there's something even more amazing to talk about, and that is this Midler tweet. She's a stone lefty, just totally bought into all of the woke stuff. And she writes, "Women of the world, ! We are being stripped of our rights over our bodies, our lives, and even of our name. They don't call us women anymore. They call us birthing people or menstruators and even people with vaginas. Don't let them erase you. Every human on earth owes you." Of course, our listeners will already know, like, what is great about this is she thinks, I mean, she seems to think that she's talking about a sort of Handmaid's Tale dystopia that has transpired after Roe was overturned. Like, that mean Clarence Thomas, like, put the cone hats on us, and now we're being called menstruators, like, which of course is exactly the kind of language that an anti-woman misogynist dystopia would employ. Except it's not. It's the stuff that they say, like, on the trans extremist left, right? Like that gender is a social construct, and birthing people, men can get pregnant, and birthing people. So I don't know, Seth. I guess they tried to like educate her, quote unquote, in the comments. But this is not limited to Bette, right? It's hard to keep track of all the contradictions, like a full-time job.
Yeah, I mean, Macy Gray was on TV the other day with what's his name, the English guy. Sorry, I'm blanking on his name. And on television, and she was saying, yeah, a woman has boobs and a vagina.
Right.
I'll call someone she if that's what they want to be called, but just because you have an operation, it doesn't make you a woman. Now this is just plain common sense. Until a few years ago, it would have been unimaginable to have this argument. But now, this is like a major thing. And, the people are so angry at Bette Midler. She's a TERF. Somebody needs to sit down and give her like she needs to, basically undergo re-education.
Right.
But, I mean, look, Bette Midler, I mean, she's like a boomer, or she may even be pre-boomer. But she came up in like the 60s and 70s performing in like bathhouses. She's utterly familiar with feminism, gay rights, gay liberation, the sexual revolution, everything, right? Like she was totally imbued with all of that. And so, it's how do you go to somebody like that and say, no, women aren't, like, there's nothing about a woman.
Women are canceled.
They're not a thing. Yeah. Women are not I mean, my wife was somewhere recently, and she saw, like, they had some club she's in, and they had a list of like positions, and it was broken down: men, non-men.
Oh,
right. Like you take like
well, that's honest.
Yeah, but like, I mean, that's the thing, is that women are not incomplete men. Right. This is what the feminist movement tried to. I mean, we're reverting to like 17th century biology.
Oh, yeah. I mean, earlier than that, right? This is the thesis of like Aquinas and
right.
Aristotle, and like, the defective men. You can get it in Euripides' Hippolytus, right? Like, oh, Zeus, why don't you let us just bring money to the temple and purchase offspring? Because these defective men, they make life worse for everybody. Yeah, it's the rankest misogyny of the kinds that would always be trotted out by like second wave feminists to suggest that, the West has always been anti-woman. And of course, all of those citations that I just like mentioned, bears saying, are more complicated than that. And there's a whole countervailing tradition, like, Musonius the Stoic, talking about the equality of virtues between genders and so forth. But that's really like neither here nor there. It's totally beside the point. What is on point is that we are watching in real time, like, the TERF phenomenon, the dynamics underlying the TERF phenomenon. Because, like, Judith Butler comes along in 1990 and announces, the third wave is here, essentially. She didn't put it in those terms, but like, and now all of this, like, womanism, all of this stuff that we've been hammering at for decades about the second wave and women's lib and women's rights and like, we are special and beautiful, women of the world unite, like, all of that is now basically ideologically suspect, is like, outdated and probably transphobic. And so, right, like, this poor, doddering, like, basically drag queen, like this old lady that used to, right, who has nothing, I'm sure has, like, nothing, but probably likes gay people better than straight people, like, is actually totally on board with, like, all the leftist projects, but just can't keep up with, like, the rolling revolution, as Scott Unor calls it, I think. And the Macy Gray thing, I guess it was Piers Morgan she was on. I just looked
Piers Morgan, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, I mean, he's the guy that they're all on. And and Piers Morgan is a kind of a turf or something. You know, he's one of these guys like Bill Maher who's like into the truth about this stuff. And poor Macy Gray goes on to say, my statement on Piers Morgan was grossly misunderstood. I respect everyone's right to be whoever they want to be. I got nothing but love for LGBT plus and transgender communities. It's like, right, but you don't get that. That's not what this is about. Like, this is about, you know, your mind being constantly occupied with nothing other than how to sort of reconform your rhetoric to the latest invention. Yeah, I mean, it is like kind of amusing to watch in real time. This was, you know, and there was kind of a moment, I feel like, where all second wave feminists, all old school feminists had to like jump to one side or the other of this chasm. And like Germaine Greer and J.K. Rowling and a couple of other big ones like just said, no, we're sort of not going there. But Gloria Steinem and, you know, all the like trendy it girls were basically like, yes, like this is the next new thing, and now they are obsolete. Like now they just have to hope that they don't fall afoul of the thing that was dreamed up today.
Now, what's funny is why is it that the whole thing of like trans men, like nobody gets that upset about trans men are men. Like the fact that Ellen Page now says she's Elliot Page and she's a man.
Right.
Like nobody really particularly cares. And I wonder if it's because like if there was a group of men standing around,
right,
and Elliot Page came marching in, demanding that he be recognized as a man, right, like nobody would particularly notice or care, right? Like it would just be, okay, who's this? like, like this little weedy guy, right? I mean, it's not like. Whereas trans women, I guess maybe because they're so, like they have this aggression, this like masculine aggression, and this demand. Because you know, ultimately, I think a lot of it is about like trans women want to have sex with lesbians,
right?
And I guess like gay men who like if there's trans men who want to have sex with gay men, I guess gay men have enough stones just to tell them to go away.
Well, sort of. I mean, from what I understand, and this truly is by word of mouth. I'm not like telling on myself here. From what I understand, like Tinder, the erstwhile, you know, dating and hookup app for gay men, is now like almost impossible to navigate because everybody on it is some sort of like NB middle, you know, like indistinguishable blob, you know. But there a whole thesis could be written, Seth, on this thing that you're identifying, the difference between like actual trans, like male to female trans women, I guess, and female to male trans men. And we probably don't have time to like fully parse it, but perhaps another time. Like I mean, look, on the one hand, right, Jordan Peterson kicked off of Twitter for saying that, you know, Ellen Page had her breasts removed or whatever. So the enforcement of the rhetoric remains pretty much the same the world over. But like trans women, that is men who, you know, castrate themselves and get fake breasts and whatever, like they do seem to be the object, the kind of flashpoint. And yeah, part of it has to do with the fact that like there's a great lie inherent in transgenderism, which is that men somehow mind if girls are kind of like manly or like are, you know, sort of want to be one of the guys. Like they'll give a girl like that trouble, like, you know, they'll make fun of her, but like basically a girl that tomboys are like beloved among like there are a lot of men that like really like tomboys. And so if it's like, you know, this kind of goofy, obviously disturbed person who cuts her breasts off, like yeah, they're unlikely to be particularly threatened by that as like an attack on masculinity. Whereas like femininity, you know, part of its charm is like it actually is vulnerable in this way. And like men who insert themselves into like female spaces are like really performing an act of aggression. I mean, I'm sure like our colleague Helen Roy would have lots to say about this. But yeah, I think like it's fundamentally different because like womanhood is a sort of a delicate thing, and like for men to come charging into it is the height of, you know, anti-nature. It's like the height of that sort of transgression, which is why they insist upon it.
Yeah, like the Michigan Women's Music Festival, for example, which, when I was in the, I don't know, whatever, in the 80s and 90s, we would always sort of snicker about it
Sure.
because it just sounded like totally cornball,
Yeah.
like some folk festival of like, lesbians or whatever. But the fact that I discovered recently, well, it doesn't exist anymore. They had to shut it down because they didn't want to let trans women in. And that just actually seemed like, oh, well, that's like I mean, of all the things that actually seem like Handmaid Tale-ish,
Right.
like that does, even though they would see it as like some kind of like progressive triumph. But the fact that like, a bunch of like folk music loving lesbians can't really get together and have their party anymore.
Yeah.
That actually seems like kind of a loss, weirdly enough.
100%. Right. I mean, it's always when this stuff intrudes upon the sort of women's lib stuff, you see that a lot of it was kind of, some of it was bad, but a lot of it was kind of harmless. And like, yeah, you want there to, I personally think like tomboys are great, even like butch lesbians really great. Like, so yeah, why should they be forced into submission to this like absolutely maddening regime? And who would agree with us, Seth, is Bette Midler, whether or not she intends to. So I think we can now shut the podcast down forever because we've now agreed with Bette Midler on the American Mind podcast. Let it be known that this has happened. Hell, I'm sure, has frozen over, and we'll see you all at the second coming. Thank you for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to learn more, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. You can donate to support the show at claremont.org/donate, and don't forget to rate, review, share, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. That review is really helpful. If you can find it in your heart to give us a 5-star review, it helps other people to find the show. And if you can find it in your heart to keep your criticisms to yourself, we appreciate that as well. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you all next week.